All right, thank you all for your patience. My name's Tim Timpshire. I'm a former director of the Governance Institute and current Queensland State Councillor. And I'll be your chair for this morning or this afternoon or evening, wherever you happen to be joining us today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians on all of the lands on which we meet. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all First Nations people here today. Welcome to our webinar on the role of the board in remuneration strategy and governance. Would you please utilise the features available in Zoom to engage with us today? You're welcome to use the chat box, but it would be preferred, if possible, to use the Q&A feature to ask any questions you have of the panellists today. With the stakes being high on success and failure of boards and executive teams, there's an urgency to get compensation right. Stakeholder expectations and scrutiny have sharpened, while changes to regulation have added further dimensions to the discussion. But with the disruptions of the past few years and the continuing uncertainty, REM strategy has become marsh ground. On the one hand, it continues to be a key indicator and driver of performance. On the other, its structure and strategy has become tricky as talent movement and workforce disruptions become the norm. The stakeholder focus on ESG has also become a factor. The role of boards has never been more crucial or challenging in driving REM strategy and getting it right to drive both the performance and for talent retention and recruitment. Many boards are looking to see what the markets are saying, but how clear are those signals and what are boards able to draw from that to help shape or reshape REM strategy and design? These are some of the tactical issues that we'll discuss today. I'd like to now briefly introduce our panellists. Sybil Krieger, Non-Executive Director of Open Pay Group, is an experienced non-executive director who has held the chair and non-executive director roles across multiple sectors in both listed and unlisted companies. She has over 40 years of broad commercial experience as a corporate lawyer, non-executive director, and economic regulator. Sybil's particular focus as a non-executive director has been on corporate governance, organisational culture, and remuneration governance in sectors undergoing significant change or reform. Sybil's currently a non-executive director of Open Pay Group Limited, MyState Limited, AEMO Services Limited, and Ventia Services Group Limited. She's a member of the advisory board of Law Squared and has previously served as chair of Zenith IP Group Limited, a non-executive director of Sydney Ports Corporation, All Connects Water, Taswater, Vector Limited, AEMO Limited, and as a trustee of the Royal Botanic Gardens and Domain Trust and of the Sydney Grammar School. In addition, for 6 years, Sybil served as a tribunal member of the Principal New South Wales Economic Regulatory Tribunal, IPART. Simon Kennedy is a partner of Aon. He leads Aon's People Solutions business in Australia and Aon's Human Capital Solutions across Australia and New Zealand. They're a team of over 130 people, helping over 2,000 clients drive business performance and manage risks through people. Simon has over 20 years experience advising companies in people strategy and financial performance, assisting companies operating across a global geography from industries including oil and gas, utilities, energy trading, mining, construction, government, life sciences, education and professional services. His clients include a range of top FTSE and ASX listed private held companies, not-for-profits and smaller fast growth companies. Prior to working for Aon, Simon held various people and financial performance positions with Mercer, EDF Energy, TXU and PwC. Laura Wanlass, also a partner at Aon, is joining us from the US. Laura is a partner and global leader of Aon's corporate governance and ESG consulting practice. which helps clients of all sizes, maturities, and industries understand and assess their potential exposure under the multitude of governance-related policies and guidelines established by investors and their advisors, regulators, and other external stakeholders. Laura also has experience in federal taxation, business formations, financial and econometric modelling practices. Prior to joining Aon, she worked in both the legal and business environments. Laura is also the Vice President of the Phoenix chapter of the National Association of Stock Plan Professionals and is a 3-time Rebel Rally competitor. I'd like to invite Laura to speak first, who will focus on ESG trends for boards globally. She'll look at the board's role in ESG oversight and what that entails. She'll also look at the executive management's role in management, oversight, and mitigation of risk and disclosure. Laura.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me today. I'm happy to join you all from Phoenix, Arizona. Let me share my screen. Let's hope I do this correctly. Okay, get in presentation mode. Okay, just takes a second to show up. There you go. All right, I think we're good to go. So interesting times in that directors are under increased negative scrutiny from financial stakeholders like never before. You know, basically institutional investors, insurance companies, lenders, and even activist shareholders are really looking at directors from multiple angles. So it's really important to think through what the role of the board is and the role of management as it relates to a topic like ESG. Now, how a board governs ESG, as well as how transparent they are about that governance, is very important right now. So it's not just the practice of governance, but it's also the transparency around the governance of ESG that is important to some of these financial stakeholders. Take into account the complexity of ESG itself, the changing macroeconomic environment, the changing global regulatory environment, and the fact that customers increasingly care about ESG, employees increasingly care about ESG. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that it is really difficult to try to navigate all of the different stakeholder expectations about ESG right now. And given the stakes being so high, especially for public companies and private companies alike, it's really important that boards really get a good grasp on how they should be navigating this issue, depending on what their size, industry, and maturity are at this point. With that, takes us to the first slide, which is really about what is the role of the board on ESG and what is the role of management. At a high level, the obvious answer about the role of the board is that it's not to micromanage management on ESG, just like any topic, but it is important that the board knows enough about the topic to be able to hold the management team accountable, right? And to know what types of questions to ask and to be armed with the right resources to adequately assess what management is telling them about their ESG strategy, and even to be able to communicate to other stakeholders about the reasonableness of whatever their company's actions are on ESG. So what are the key topics that we're seeing in play for the board of directors right now as it relates to ESG? On the left-hand side, it's 3 main components. The first is that companies are increasingly having to appoint directors with relevant expertise on ESG. And it might be, you know, some of the C-suite executives that you'd normally hire, you know, maybe they have experience in how they've navigated ESG at their other companies, or maybe it's coming from non-traditional places. Maybe you're looking to more consulting firms or academic institutions to find individuals with ESG or corporate social responsibility or sustainability type expertise to bring to the board. But increasingly, there's the expectation that someone on the board has relevant expertise on this topic. The second thing that we're seeing is an increased call for participation in ongoing education around ESG risks and opportunities. It's no longer acceptable to simply just say that you take into account ESG. Increasingly, stakeholders want to know, how are you staying current on these topics? And then lastly, it's about embedding ESG responsibilities for a specific company within your formal corporate governance charter documents. So which key committees are really tasked with owning ESG, with environment and climate, human capital management and remuneration, and then cybersecurity, right? All topics that are actually ESG or subtopics of ESG needing to make their way into the formal document itself. On the right-hand side, then you have the role of management, and it's two main functions there. It's managing oversight and risk mitigation, as well as managing the disclosure channels around ESG. And disclosure isn't just regulatory filings, it's also all communications on ESG. So in terms of managing oversight and risk mitigation, management has a crucial role to play in keeping the board up to speed on ESG risks and opportunities, oftentimes setting up education sessions and giving them access to the resources and information that they need to truly assess the effectiveness of the company's ESG strategy. So it takes a lot of cooperation between the board and management, similar to how boards have effectively operated on things like remuneration for years. Management must also set up the governance frameworks internally to govern E&S, right? You can't actually do E&S without the G. I think all of us on the phone agree you need a strong governance framework, even on the management side, to effectively set goals and manage progress towards those goals. And then I would say that the third and fourth points on this managing oversight issue is using data and analytics to measure progress on ESG goals and to know at all times whether you're an outlier relative to benchmarking peers and other external stakeholder expectations. So again, just like it's complex for the board, it's incredibly complex for management as well. It's a cross-departmental exercise that takes a lot of coordination across business units, requires data and analytics, requires the cadence of the board, and requires you to set targets that get transparently disclosed externally, which is the last point on disclosure. It's making sure that you're adequately disclosing what you're doing on ESG oversight, practices and policies, as well as using reporting frameworks that your financial stakeholders expect, such as like SASB materiality framework, GRI, TCFD. I'm throwing out a bunch of acronyms just like I threw out ESG. It's a whole alphabet soup of different disclosure expectations that management must increasingly navigate nowadays. So what are the top ESG related trends that we are hearing from board members right now? And as a poll survey every year, it's global, and we boiled it down to 6 key themes in terms of what we've heard from board members. Now, the first is that remuneration committees are no longer just remuneration committees dealing with exec comp. They've expanded the purview of their scope to human capital initiatives, right? And so for a lot of companies, and Simon will get into this later, it means changing your name, but also really expanding the scope of duties that you're overseeing to broader workforce analytics, as well as to things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. The second trend that we're hearing, or key item that board members are concerned with right now from our poll survey, the need for reboarding of the board. So everybody onboards new directors with information about their company when they're bringing a new director on, related to the key committee that they might sit on. But increasingly, because ESG is so complex, we're finding that more directors are asking for more formal education, whether that's through going to events like the GIA or events hosted by, in the US, we have the NACD and others. Directors are looking for more forums to network and find out more about topics like ESG so that they can increase their skill set and properly manage their role. The third thing that we're hearing about is increasingly board members are asking management about tying executive compensation to ESG related goals. And we'll talk in a second about when that might be an appropriate time in a company's life cycle to tie ESG to comp, but increasingly it's on everybody's radars. It's not that investors and other financial stakeholders expect you to immediately tie executive comp to ESG, but you have to be able to explain why you haven't done so if you're not at that stage yet. And oftentimes it's really understanding where you are in your ESG journey to be able to answer that question appropriately. The fourth thing to talk about, outside of the largest cap companies, most of the world, most of the small to mid caps are just at the beginning of their ESG journey, right? Outside of a few select industries like mining and utilities where they've been doing ESG forever, most companies are trying to figure out how to start. And the most typical way to start your ESG journey is to really think through what the board's level of oversight on ESG would be and which material risks and opportunities you should start with in terms of ESG at the board. So it's really the first step that we're hearing from board members is, where do I start? And the most common place to start for board members that we hear is really figuring out who's going to oversee those risks and opportunities. The fifth thing that was interesting that we heard from the survey was about climate change and even just environmental concerns. More than 70% of our respondents said that climate was not specifically called out as a duty at the board. Usually it's broader ESG, human capital is very increasingly common as a listed duty, but climate in most regions is not specifically called out as something that is in the board's purview. We expect that to change as the regulations change globally, Australia, US, everywhere. And then lastly, there's a lot of questions around the diversity of the board itself. And in most countries, that is really about the gender composition of your board. In places like the US, there's also an ethnicity component to your diversity composition. And basically, financial stakeholders really want to see transparent disclosure for public companies about the types of individuals that are overseeing your company. Again, gender and then ethnicity if you're in certain regions. And then below the actual idea about your demographic information, financial stakeholders for both private and for public companies, they want to understand what types of skills your board members have and how that relates to the company's long-term success. And so again, skills on climate, skills on environmental, skills on broader ESG, human capital, those are all things that more companies are being asked to disclose transparently about. Okay, so I have this curve here, and you'll all get these slides later. I just show this so that you can understand that ESG really isn't about a one and done journey. It's a series of activities, cross-departmental activities within your company. And there's a process that you have to take every year, multiple times a year, to really properly navigate ESG. And that's basically engaging with key stakeholders to identify material ESG topics, setting goals and tracking progress towards those goals, and then communicating and disclosing progress towards those goals in a transparent way. That's the bottom row of this chart. Seems simple, right? But as the world evolves and the stakeholder expectations evolve, you'll find that you're going to need increased flexibility in terms of setting those goals, tracking progress towards those goals, and then being able to provide the context to all of your stakeholders about where you are in your journey and whether where you're at in your journey makes sense relative to your stakeholders' expectations. And there's a lot of examples of this out there in the public domain in terms of companies setting commitments on diversity or climate or just broader human capital. Step one is to set commitments. Step one is to create some type of goals. But the next natural expectation of stakeholders is that you start actually measuring progress towards those goals and then giving everybody line of sight into where you are. And so that's just table stakes at this point. If you'll notice at the top of this curve is tying your executive compensation programs to ESG. And that's basically to reflect the fact you don't just start with tying exec comp to ESG. It's an end point, right? Because it's about accountability. It's the point where you feel like you've done enough in your ESG strategy to get to the point where it makes sense to start tying compensation outcomes to the accomplishment of ESG goals. So there's a lot that has to happen before then, and Simon will talk a lot about that later on. But I feel like this is a helpful graphic. Key takeaway here is, again, ESG isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. And it's important for board members to think about that. You might sit on a large cap board, and then you might also sit on a small cap board or private cap board. It's really important to think about the industry sector, the size and the maturity of the company in determining what their prioritization should be of ESG strategy. You know, you don't want to be an outlier on the top or the bottom because it puts you at risk for activism or litigation, et cetera. And so really when you think about what the keys to success on ESG are, it's consistent and compelling messaging across all communication channels. It's ensuring proper oversight and coordination with management and the board. And it's prioritizing and reporting on risks and opportunities that make sense for your company at the stage at which you're at. And then lastly, understanding how your risks and opportunities are really changing across different variables at any given time. So the last 4 points I just made, it's about governance, right? It's about the governance of your ESG strategy. It's probably the most important thing that exists within a company at this point. Okay, that's my spiel.
Thank you, Laura. A quick question for you. Could you just, in just 60 seconds, respond to the question, what sort of risks do you see over disclosure on ESG matters?
Yeah, over disclosure is just as dangerous as under disclosure. You know, you could be accused of greenwashing, right? We definitely see companies think about benchmarking what their peers are putting out there in a public forum, which is really helpful, right? To know if you're being competitive in the market. You don't want to just rush and adopt disclosure because somebody else did. You need to make sure that you're at the right point in your maturity curve to make that disclosure. Again, you could find yourself the subject of litigation, regulatory actions, and even shareholder activism if you over disclose something that you're not ready to commit to with an outcome.
That's great. Thank you. If you wouldn't mind just, you've stopped sharing. That's great. Thank you. We'll now turn to Sybil, who will speak on the role of boards in shaping and driving remuneration strategy and the need to be far-sighted. One that is fit for purpose for the size, complexity, risk profile, and risk cycle of the business. She will look at the constant tension between the need to be really precise and accurate at one end of the spectrum and to exercise discretion at the other end of that spectrum. The more precise and the more quantitative frameworks are, the more fragmented they tend to become. She'll look at how ongoing disruptions have challenged boards on REM and what she thinks may need to change in the consideration of short, mid, and long-term incentive frameworks. Thank you.
Very much, Tim, and thank you, Laura. That was a great brisk canter through the landscape. I will focus today mainly on my experience on listed boards. Currently 3 of my boards are listed, and for my sins, I'm chair of People, Rem and Nominations on all 3 of them. And what Laura said about the journey related to ESG and the very different stages that companies are at, I think is particularly the case in Australia. On my boards, one has reached the stage of tying executive REM to ESG outcomes, and the others are still getting their baseline measurements and adopting TCFD. So there's a very broad spectrum of responses, but everyone accepts that this is an inevitability. So good morning, everyone. What I wanted to speak about today are some very broad topics on the relationship between what the board does and the remuneration framework for the executive. And to start from a very big picture start, I think the main things that boards bring to the remuneration outcome and framework have to be wisdom, courage, and fairness. I'll give you a couple of examples of each of those so that you can see what I mean by them. In terms of wisdom, for example, I think it's important for a board to make sure that the remuneration framework is appropriate for the size, the complexity, and the risk profile of the business, and also the risk cycle of the business. In other words, in the ordinary course of business, how long does it take for adverse outcomes and risks to bubble to the surface? And does the remuneration framework bear some reasonable relationship to that? I think it's also incumbent on the board to choose a remuneration framework that's appropriate for the shareholder base. If you have a shareholder base of mainly retail shareholders, it's very easy to over-engineer a remuneration framework to the point where it's very difficult to explain to your typical shareholder. I think it's important to make sure that the remuneration framework reflects the key strategic aims of the business. But in addition to strategic aims, I think it's most important that the REM framework works with and facilitates the corporate culture that you're trying to encourage and doesn't hold out incentives that effectively work against the corporate culture that the board wants to encourage. Tim referred to this constant tension between accuracy and complexity on the one hand and simplicity on the other hand. In a lot of sectors, there's a drive for higher and higher accuracy in the variable part of the remuneration. And if you take that to its logical conclusion, you have 20 factors and each of them have a maximum of 5%, and you end up with an almighty fragmentation of the various things that are meant to be incentives. The other risk that you have if you go down that hyper accurate path is that the really key things are undifferentiated, and that something that really is sufficiently important to raise a question as to whether there should be any short-term incentive paid in a particular year may have been weighted to only 5%, and then you're in the difficult position of really only being able to take away 5% for something that's not adequately reflected in that measure. On the other hand, oversimplification is a risk, and I was listening to a seminar the other day which reflected the fact that for long-term incentives, for example, fewer companies, a lot of companies used to ride on the single measure of total shareholder returns, and that people are moving away from that because it produces an all or nothing outcome. And for a long-term incentive, there has to be a bit more of a nuanced spectrum than all or nothing turning on a second decimal point. So a degree of wisdom is required to navigate that tension between accuracy and not killing the incentive effect of simplicity, but at the same time making sure that the key things have an appropriate weighting given the risk profile and the size of the business. I think it's sometimes important for boards to step back from the frameworks that have been set up and to look at what the really number one priority is. To give you an example, on one of my boards, the mantra of the company is health and safety above all else. That is the number one brand promise of the company to its stakeholders, its customers, and its employees. In the past, safety was a component of the short-term incentive scheme, and it had a reasonable weighting, but it's a company in which there's a real fatality risk. So what we did was we made safety an overarching trigger for board discretion, and it can serve either as a gateway or as a modifier to give safety the prominence that we really want it to have in this business. And in the event that we had what we considered to be an avoidable fatality, we would seriously consider underscoring that by a complete modification to zero of all short-term incentives for the executive team. So I think that there are a couple of other aspects that I wanted to touch on. In setting up remuneration frameworks, particularly short-term incentives, I think it's important to look one by one at the executive team and to look at the actual span of their responsibilities, because you actually lose the incentive effect which you're trying to achieve if you give people remuneration outcomes for things that they have no means of controlling. In other words, there has to be a reasonable relationship between the span of control and responsibility of the executive and the particular makeup of their incentive structure. On the other hand, there will be corporate-wide objectives which you're trying to achieve, and particularly those that depend on collaboration, and there it's entirely appropriate to set company-wide measures to encourage collaboration to achieve those, and to be careful not to set measures which are zero-sum games, in other words, where one person can only succeed at the expense of another, to make sure that collaboration is in fact encouraged rather than competition. And finally, in terms of courage, I think that it's really important for boards to use the discretion that they have. The norm in Australia is that the board has an overriding discretion both in respect of long-term incentives and in respect of short-term incentives, and it comes up particularly often in short-term incentives. I think boards need to have the courage to exercise that discretion, both up and down. But part of that courage involves transparency. There's no point in doing it unless you're also prepared to explain in some detail your reasons for going one way or the other, explaining why you preferred one outcome over the other or emphasized a particular outcome. And I think that boards need to be increasingly willing to exercise discretion on the basis of things that are relatively hard to measure, such as detriment to corporate reputation or non-compliance resulting in reputational damage. So they are my broad themes of wisdom, courage, and fairness. Fairness also comes into the exercise of discretion, and in order to be fair in the way that I'm talking about, I think the board needs to be well informed, not only on the performance of the executive team as a whole, but on the performance and contribution of individuals to be able to make those decisions. So that's what I wanted to cover to start with, Tim.
That's great. Thank you, Sybil. A quick question for you. Where do you see REM frameworks going over the next few years? What do you think will change?
I think one of the key things that is already changing, and this relates back to what Laura was talking about, is in the past, at least in Australia, there's been two categories, financial measures and non-financial measures. And stakeholders, particularly investors, have waxed and waned as to whether they want predominantly financial measures or whether they're happy to have some non-financial measures. And I think that that's changing. I think the reason for that mindset was because financial measures were equated to quantitative measures. They were measurable, they were highly measurable, and non-financial measures were thought to be soft and subjective and qualitative. Whereas now we have so much data available to analyse to support decisions on remuneration that I think that split will drop over time, and it will become a question not of financial and non-financial, but of qualitative and quantitative measures. And overwhelmingly, they'll be quantitative measures because we have the means to make them quantitative. The second issue that I think is of some concern is, again, at least in Australia, there's constant pressure from regulators to lengthen the span of long-term incentives, to make the performance periods and the holding lock periods longer and longer rather than shorter. And I understand where that comes from, and I understand in particular where that's come from in financial services. But it seems to me that we run into a problem where the performance periods and holding locks for long-term incentives become considerably longer than the average turnover in those executive roles. And when that's the case, it seems to me that they lose all incentive effect if people simply aren't in those roles long enough for long-term incentives to vest. And I think that may be an occasion of public sector regulators coming up with a concept that they haven't experienced because they have transportable remuneration frameworks from one job to the next, whereas private sector employees tend to lose their long-term incentive when they move on. And as we've heard just from the stats, job tenure is becoming shorter, and the incentive is to change jobs because that's how people get their best pay increase. So I think we run into a structural problem there eventually.
Thanks. I think they're really insightful comments, and I think it's easy to imagine that over the last couple of years, we've all got a lot better at dealing with uncertainty. We've certainly had our fair share of that. And also, as you say, dealing with data that's not as quantitative as we might otherwise have been comfortable with. I think we're getting much better at that generally. And that certainly we're seeing in Australia, the clarification in our favourite Section 181 of the Corporations Act getting us all okay with the longer term view and boards being able to take that into account in managing organisations. So interesting stuff. Simon will speak next, and he's going to talk to us about how market data can strengthen and support an organisation's talent strategy. He'll look at some of the intelligence coming from markets at the moment and have a look at how people related challenges remain front of mind for boards, how significant complexity and uncertainty requires a data-based approach to manage workforce challenges. He'll also have a look at 4 key converging factors: digital skills, social and work life, macroeconomic, and stakeholders. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks, Tim, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be talking to you all today. And I have to say, and that was planned in some sense, but equally the conversation just then and Sybil's comment around the move to quantitative measures away from qualitative is very much the theme of what I'm about to talk to, and the reason why we've bookended this session around data. So just before I get started, you'll get a copy of these slides, so no need to worry about taking too much of this down. There's a couple of extra ones at the end that go through a couple of examples. I hope you found those 2 presentations really interesting. I certainly did. Laura's insights on ESG and the board, which are becoming an important risk management framework for boards to navigate. Laura mentioned how important transparency is for ESG. Transparency needs good data to support those decisions and that decision making, which I'm covering today. She also talked about having the right people on the board. I'm talking about how to provide the data to best support finding those right people. Sybil talked about shared her experience around that ever-evolving role of REM co-chair, REM committees, the complexity for boards managing REM strategy and governance around those today. She talked about the discretion, how important discretion is. Discretion can definitely be fact-based. Absolutely. She talked about aligning a REM strategy and org culture. Org culture is probably one of the harder things to measure, but actually we're getting more and more data together and getting more and more frameworks these days that are making that easier to do. So you can sort of see where I'm going with this. I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes or so exploring the tactical side of remuneration and broader talent strategy. And so one of the themes you would have heard both Laura and Sybil talk through is that the extension of the need for market data or good data around not just REM, but broader talent strategy. So we'll definitely focus on market data and how it strengthens and supports an organization's REM, but also talent strategy. So market data has always been important for boards, but the results of our most recent board and executive remuneration report really has put a spotlight on the importance of human strategy to boards as they work to navigate the current sort of volatile, unpredictable, complex and ambiguous world we operate in these days. So in turn, market data and increasingly the broader talents data has never been more relevant and crucial for boards to access, validate and synthesize in their role of managing both remuneration strategy and broader talent and business strategy. So I'm going to take you through the application of market remuneration data and then broaden out a little bit and look at a couple of different ideas around broader talent strategy data that sort of feeds into that conversation around ESG and getting more insight around talent in an organization. So I just move these slides. Okay, so I'll start with market remuneration data. So as a long-time reward advisor, which is where my broader background is, it's pretty close to my heart. One of the interesting trends we're seeing over the last few years related to market data is really the proliferation of stakeholders who are keen to understand more about remuneration strategy, which translates to how organizations are motivating the behavior of their executives and the broader employee base. And the nature and adequacy of the governance they have in place to manage that ongoing alignment between REM strategy, talent, and business strategy, which is one of those things that's never a once and done. It's certainly an ongoing process. Market data very earlier in my career, market data was always the domain of the HR function, really. It was about benchmarking pay and a pay review. But market data is increasingly accessed by and referenced by governments, regulators, proxy advisors, social interest groups, boards, of course, and employers themselves. A lot of firms are now making market data transparent within the organisation, so employees can see how much different levels are paid. In some organisations, they actually publish pay levels on their websites. So, given this proliferation of interest and the stakeholders they manage, the source of market data, therefore, and the veracity with which it's constructed and understood is a critical input for boards to understand and to be comfortable with. It's really important that you're comfortable with the data that you're using, that you have a good advisor, a good internal team that is supporting you around explaining the data, its source, how it's been put together, and that you're comfortable making decisions around it. So I'd call out here in particular for listed firms the need for boards to adequately brief proxy advisors and their investor relation functions, and share the considerations and the inputs that went into the decisions that they may have made around remuneration at any particular time, and to explain and sort of source the data that underpins those decisions. For non-listed firms and NGOs, which I know there are a lot on the call today in particular, while you don't have proxy advisors to deal with, governments, regulators, financiers are all, they have an increasing focus on remuneration strategy and outcome-based pay decisions, with so much at stake from a reputational and societal perspective. So for the last 3 years, the Governance Institute of Australia and Aon have partnered to publish a board and executive remuneration report, and it combines individual data with the annual report disclosures of the ASX 300. So I think it's the largest of its kind in the Australian market. Many of you on this call have participated in it, and hopefully you're familiar with it. We've had a lot of interest in this year's survey. So there's more than 230 organisations this year, which is up 25% or so since last year. So there's a lot more organisations are really hunting around and looking for good data at the moment. The survey report, which was released sort of on June 29, provides insights from both listed and unlisted company boards. It gives us an insight into what boards are thinking. There's a lot of qualitative information in there, in addition to the detailed remuneration around non-executive directors and executives from both unlisted and listed firms. This year, we also started to collect a lot more information around the demographics of NEDs and execs. So the age, tenure, gender composition, and some more company dimensional information to really start to feed this need for broader data sets. So I'm giving you this detail on the survey just to underscore the importance of knowing the data, where it's sourced, when, and its application. This is the type of data boards need to know they have access to, and but they need to know that they've got a team around them supporting them to validate, to synthesize that information whilst they're feeding that into board decisions. And probably worth pointing out, given some of the new dimensional data we're collecting now, market data is moving quite beyond purely focusing on remuneration data. There's a lot more about an organization's workforce and talent strategy you can benchmark these days. It's growing literally daily, weekly, monthly, as new data sources and new technology help us do that. So we can sort of, we're now looking at being able to assess not only really in-year performance, but sustainable performance over multiple years, which I'll touch on earlier and Sybil had touched on in her section. So sticking with remuneration just for a little bit longer before we get to talent strategy. Even just thinking about benchmarking incentives, which tends to be focused on relative performance, the availability of peer group data is key. So the depth and the breadth that you have around competitors and peers is what you need to look for in good market data that you're using. So being able to have a look at data around revenue, around industry, around geography, around organizational and operational complexity, convergent talent pools, these are all important lenses you need to be able to cut data around so that you're making like for like comparisons. So to be fair, look, and I do hear this, and it's, it's a good conversation to have. At times people will voice a concern that too much data can be an issue, and it can possibly impact the board's ability to exercise discretion, which is a really important aspect of the board's remit when it comes to remuneration outcomes. So that's probably a topic for a whole nother webinar, to be honest. But we've seen plenty of examples. I mean, it's fair to say discretion can absolutely be fact-based, and I think more and more discretion, the ability to back it up with fact-based information is where organisations, where boards, where markets are moving. We've certainly seen plenty of examples of ASX listed boards moving to increase the weighting of non-financial measures, for example, for their exec teams, and doing a pretty good job of communicating why, how, and the governance around the outcomes using robust data that proxy advisors have actually been comfortable with, which is perhaps not a situation we were used to seeing 4 or 5 years ago, where proxy advisors really were not loving the move to non-financial measures at all. But the more you can support that with data and fact-based decision making, the better chance you have of getting that message through, of really communicating, sort of as Laura touched on, what you're doing, why you're doing, and the governance around that. But I guess once you start incorporating ESG type measures into incentives, and you can ask Laura lots of questions about this in the Q&A because it's quite fascinating, you quickly need to access broader data sets to be in a position to adequately and robustly assess the performance. So particularly when you need to, on a relative basis, I think, like from my perspective, having worked in this space for a long time, this is where I see there's the most need for change on the horizon, and perhaps, you know, where there's the most opportunity in some sense to create new and nuanced data sets that go beyond the traditional salary survey and small number of supplementary reports available here in Australia on REM for NEDs and execs. Where at Aon, we're certainly working on this, so watch this space. And again, you know, we can pick that up in the Q&A. There's a lot of really interesting things we're doing. Laura's been doing in the US and in Europe around that, and we're just looking at how we start doing that in Australia shortly. Let's look at the talent side now. Let me just, just a bit of delay in changing my slides. But we'll move from remuneration and look at broader data sets for talent strategy. And I'm just going to touch on this fairly briefly. It's a fairly extensive topic, but I just wanted to give you some sense of what's out there, where we're going, and the sort of things that you might think about in terms of broader data sets that you might access to make decisions. So we all know organizations, you know, its workforce, its talent drives a lot of the internal challenges that face boards today. In recent studies that both the Governance Institute and Aon have run, we know the workforce drives 8 out of 10 internal challenges for board. So top of mind for that, you might have always thought about, you know, business sustainability, transformational capability, big ticket items. There are many more that are becoming increasingly important. So, you know, like, for example, increased regulation and disclosure obligations like CPS 511, regulation around psychosocial hazards, WGEA and gender reporting. We've got culture and wellbeing of staff, board composition and planning, DE&I, which is a really important one. Digital transformation, I think, which isn't just the fancy tech. It's also that the digital capability of the workforce and their ability to adapt and leverage new technologies, which is a huge one. I think there's not many annual reports that you would read these days that doesn't have an organization's top 5 strategy revolving around, in some way, revolving around digital transformation. So that 8 out of 10 becomes quite important. But really, if you think about it over the last 2.5 years, this need, or there's been a significant escalation in the need for organisations to be able to adapt and transform while also being sustainable. I just wanted to touch on a framework that we think about this through, which I think is really helpful, and it really underscores where we're going in terms of data and the need for boards to have this data to make better decisions. So I want to walk you through 4 key macro trends that we're seeing that are directly impacting talent strategy and sustainability, and really it's driving more complexity, change, and uncertainty to the role of boards in managing not just remuneration strategy but broader talent strategy, and driving this need for these more nuanced sources of market data. So we talk about these 4 trends. We talk about digital convergence, which is, you know, really the rate of digitization, which has been propelled not only by the pandemic, it was happening before that, but really by consumer expectations and broader tech developments in technology. So this is changing the competitive landscape for talent for all organizations. Within that, we've got a skills convergence. So skills are becoming a lot more transferable across industries. So skills in data and technology and risk management are really becoming industry agnostic now. They apply to everybody. Everybody is either becoming tech or using tech to transform in that sense. This creates a lot more competition for talent with these skills, and an opportunity for those who can attract and retain the skills they need from broader talent pools, including different industries. We've got this notion of social and work-life convergence. So as we've all experienced, the lines between social and work life have blurred. What used to be in the domain of life has now become a workplace issue, which is really just adding significant complexity to managing workforces themselves. And there's this macroeconomic and stakeholder convergence concept. So This is really around that ESG piece, where companies are now walking this tightrope of balancing act between shareholder, customer, colleague, government and societal needs. And this is really one of the key drivers of this proliferation of those interested in the market data I spoke about before. So this is an Aon point of view. This isn't my personal point of view, but it's a really, this concept, we call it the Great Convergence. So this Great Convergence is forcing businesses to act and consider the questions around talent, performance, resilience and health, all of which now sit at the doorstep of boards to grapple with, all of which have data built around them. Some of it's internal data, some of it's external data, all of which we need better reporting on, better trend on, better dashboarding on, for example. So it's creating a very, very interesting environment for boards to be able to get their hands around the right information, to really have a strong position on managing the risk frameworks within any organization. So I've got a couple of slides here that these will sort of come through for you later on. There's a fair bit of detail around each of these areas, but I've included just a couple of examples for each of those frames and thinking through what types of data might be important, or what types of data could you be looking at to assess trends, to look down the track, to really understand how a strategy is being executed. So under digital convergence, and I won't read all of these out, but I'll go through a couple. I think the EVP part is really interesting. The EVP piece, so if you think about probably the best example there is, we've seen and we have seen financial institutions now compete for the same tech talent as Google or Atlassian. So this means, the EVPs for these organizations between financial institutions and tech, they need to be more focused on the organization and what it stands for, rather than just relying on an industry profile to attract talent. So in the past, if you worked in tech was a cool place to work. It had certain attributes. That's how you attracted. You now really need to think about what is your unique proposition for attracting and retaining talent? Why would they come to you? And you can use that ESG frame really cleverly to do that. So really, the other part about that is peer groups. And so as EVPs change and as you broaden your focus on talent pools, you need to also focus broaden your perspective on peer groups. The skills convergence means that the lines start to blur a lot between industries. And so where you're accessing talent, potentially is changing on a reasonably fast basis. If I look at social and work-life convergence, those key indicators around well-being and psychosocial hazards, there is a lot of metrics that we can pull out now that helps organizations understand a framework around what does a safe environment look like, what does a well employee look like, and you can start to track how the organization is progressing in providing us a place to work or a culture in which these things can be focused on, and that they can really provide, again, a point of differentiation, but also a point of responsibility for the organization. And then we've just sort of jumped back now to the report and some of the information we had in the report there. I've got a couple of examples here just to think through. And I guess one of the sort of to underscore down the right-hand side of that slide, this is the 230 organizations, the boards and the NEDs telling us sort of where is the world heading, where are we thinking that we need to focus. And so you can see there, board accountability and responsibilities will increase. Chairs and directors will probably take more, an increased responsibility anyway for corporate failure. Strategic and critical thinking are ranked as the most valuable attributes for boards. How do you measure that? How do you make sure you've got a good mix of diversity, a good mix of strategic and critical thinking on a board? There are ways to measure that, as you can imagine, and there are ways to monitor how boards are progressing on that. And there's a much greater emphasis on emotional intelligence, which I think is really interesting. The ability to tackle issues that are not black and white. And again, if you think about assessment and how you assess board members, how you assess their capabilities, you really need to think about that assessment tool, and then you need to think about the diversity of that type of talent that you have on the board. If you're able to sort of bring that to the fore for the organization. And then really, apologies, and then really sort of, I think where I'll end really is this notion of data providing boards with better governance. There's a couple of examples here that we pulled out of the report in just thinking through where can you substantiate more fact-based decision making. So that second bullet point there, I think, is a good one. So enabling better governance to meet increased regulation and personal accountabilities placed on board members and NEDs. The concept of gap analysis around regulatory requirements is really important. So to be able to understand where you are today, what are the gaps, and what's the plan or the roadmap to fill those gaps. Regulations obviously change. So you've got to continually come back to that over and over again to stay up to date and relevant. The last couple of slides are probably more GIFs that I'll send through that provide examples around how there are a couple of case examples around how organisations have tried to tackle this sort of more nuanced or subjective measurement areas, and how boards have been able to build measurement tools, I guess. So I'll leave that in there for you because I'm conscious I'm short of time. But probably just to finish off, I think given the longer term view boards take on strategy and the changing nature and unpredictability of the workforce who are critical in delivering that strategy, there is certainly increasing need for this sort of nuanced analysis to provide more governance around how talent strategy in particular is aligned to business strategy. So I think there is a lot around REM strategy and data, and there is more coming, but when you add REM and talent together, that's this new world of data and need for data. And maybe if I could finish on one point, and it's around ESG. So that the growing importance of ESG as a risk framework certainly doesn't call for less data. It calls for more data, more benchmarking, especially when it comes to REM strategy frameworks and outcomes, which is where our next challenge lies. Sort of my best and most obvious example here, I think most people would agree, is around DE&I strategies and the role of diversity in innovation and growth. Affecting change in the DE&I composition of an organisation is a strategic endeavour. It plays out over multiple years, and it can have a real material impact on an organisation's growth trajectory. So probably a question to leave you with is, how is your organisation currently placed for that journey? And I'll finish there, Tim, and come back to you.
Thank you, Simon. Now, we've always got someone that goes a little over, so I'll skip over your quick question.
That's okay.
Because we've got, no, look, it's great. It's my head's spinning. There's been so much content, so many thought-provoking issues that we've heard from each of our panelists today. I'd like to jump straight into our questions from the audience. And there's a few, so if we can have a go at working our way through those. There's still time for you to get more questions in. So please use the opportunity to put a question in through the Q&A. I noticed that we have actually disabled the chat, which makes my job a lot easier. So thanks for that. Our first question, which I think is open to all panelists. How do you see ESG working with organisational strategy and purpose? Shouldn't REM be at the top end? At the top end be based on the holistic business strategy, not just on environmental, social and governance matters? Who'd like to have a go at that? Thanks,
I can go for a second. Yeah. So there's a lot of literature and perspective out there that ESG actually does impact the bottom line. And really it comes down to more than just purpose. It is understanding how to make your organization resilient, which has the byproduct of also helping make the communities resilient as well to some degree. So a lot of companies, when they focus on their ESG strategy, they're looking at what is material from a business perspective as well. And so that could be your human capital management strategy. It could be driving diversity, equity, and inclusion, recognizing that helps with your human capital management strategy. And again, people is a material risk factor for every company, regardless of size, industry, or geography. So that's one way to move the needle on ESG. Climate could be something that matters depending on your industry as well. So I could go through all the subtopics of ESG, and you could quickly see that goals tied to ESG have a big impact on business, and thus should probably be something that could fit within a short-term or long-term incentive program. At the end of the day, though, investors aren't looking for you to create ESG goals that give big payouts and then you still miss your financial results. Like there has to be a balance between your financial results and the achievement of ESG goals.
Thanks, Sybil.
I have not yet come across a company in Australia where results turn primarily on ESG. I think we're a long way away from that. We're still at the point where we're struggling to integrate them into the frameworks that we currently do. So I don't think that's a real risk. But I think also it's a mistake to think about ESG as a kind of inhibiting risk that needs to be dealt with at considerable cost. It actually has a real upside opportunity. And one of the great things about ESG is to focus the organization on long-term risks and opportunities that aren't currently quantifiable. And I'd really like to emphasize the opportunity part of that as well as the risk. So I think it should not be regarded as a sort of net negative, yet another compliance issue to deal with. And it does actually serve to take the thinking to a longer time frame.
Thanks, Sybil. I think that just to follow on from that comment as well, and I think it's in some ways disappointing that we continually refer to risks and think that they're all downside problems to deal with. And you know, our international standard on risk certainly doesn't make that mistake, but one place to go looking for those opportunities is in the area of reputation, and there's plenty of others. But my comment is there is still plenty of opportunity. There's plenty of time to be, particularly in Australia, perhaps a first mover in this space, and that in itself, I think, is one of those opportunities. We have another question. I think this one is predominantly addressed to Laura, but anyone's free to have a go. Any big differences in the US versus Australia in respect to all of the matters that we've just discussed?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest differences are going to be on the regulatory environment, and this is true globally. If you think about ESG, there's really a couple different factors every company deals with. It's the legal and regulatory environment, it's the investor perspective, the customer perspectives, and then the employee perspective. Regional nuance makes a big difference. So here in the States, most of the initial focus has been on human capital management, and then climate is coming next from an ESG perspective, right? In terms of how far we're going to push for disclosure. In Australia, obviously different regulations and different focus, primarily on the climate side, especially coming forth right now too. So I would say the differences are just purely a result of regional nuance driven by regulation.
Thanks. And I think that it's interesting to see that coming out of IFRS, the International Sustainability Standards Board, setting regulations that enable different jurisdictions to opt into that framework in as much as they want to. So hopefully we'll see a lot more comparability between jurisdictions of ESG disclosures to come. But I think that's very much remains to be seen how we go with that. It does open the opportunity to discuss, as Laura mentioned in her opening remarks, about the alphabet soup we have to deal with. There is so much terminology, and the mergers and partnering of integrated reporting, SASB, CDSB, TCFDs. There are all of these things that we need to try to get our heads around, and it's constantly moving. One of those that was actually thrown up into a question in chat was, what does DEI stand for? And thanks for that question, because I think now that may have been answered. We've mentioned a couple of times diversity, equity, and inclusion. But it's very easy to pass these acronyms by, and I'm sure there's plenty of people that were wondering exactly the same thing. We have more questions. The next is, it seems the shift towards our executive variable REM isn't increasing, I suppose I'll paraphrase, nearly fast enough. There still seems to be a focus on fixed REM. And the question here is, do we see that changing? Is that particularly important? Is it an issue, do you think, that we're only having a smaller amount of executive rem being that variable or at-risk component? And obviously that's a statement that's been made in a question. Any comments? Simon, you've had a lot of think about the data behind a lot of these metrics. Is that a statement you'd agree with or have some comments about?
Well, I think it was probably some context. We need a bit more contextual information about the industry and the context. But yeah, I mean, I think we certainly see that in the data that comes through in terms of that is absolutely happening. Is it a good outcome for shareholders and stakeholders? Right? It really comes down to if you think about the entire package or that sort of that total reward concept, like what elements of that package are driving behavior, and is that package set up to drive the right behavior? So there's a really divergent view on variable pay and its role, and there are people that sit at both ends of those camps. And I've sat on a few other webinars where there really is a big push in Australia for having a proper look at variable pay and its role. But I think it's, the broader question to think about is what is the organisation incentivizing that person to achieve, that executive to achieve? And if that is okay, and if you're comfortable with that, I don't think you need that variable piece is only one component of several components that we set people up to drive performance through. One of the biggest issues, some of organisations like superannuation funds, where there is no variable pay, and you've got regulators saying there's having a lot to say about variable pay and incentives. What do you do for that industry? So it has to be a much more holistic perspective than just looking at one aspect of pay.
Thank you. Our next question, I'll just read it out exactly what it says. It says, does perf rights issued form part of the REM committee framework? And I'm a little uncertain whether we're talking about performance rights or preference rights, but I wonder if anyone would like to have a go at that question. Sybil, in the work that you're doing as chairing 3 of these committees, is there anything that I guess is off the table that you aren't, as a REM committee, addressing?
No, I think that particularly that relates to long-term incentives, and also in some cases where short-term incentives are only partly paid in cash and partly in equity instruments of various kinds. But the one that you choose is very much a question of the sector that you're in, the time frame that you're looking over, and also the capital construct of the organisation, its capacity to issue equity. All those things get taken into account. But I've seen the use of options, I've seen the use of performance rights, I've seen the use of market price options, zero price options. So you can engineer it any way you like, subject to my limitation that I mentioned early on of don't make it so complex that your shareholders can't understand it.
It's wonderful I get the opportunity to chair this session, because I get to slide in a question of my own. And that is, does that change at all, do you think, for non-profit organisations and charities? Is there any similar sorts of concerns around incentivising and using funding sources in that way?
I think there necessarily has to be. I mean, for a start, you cannot have an LTI really outside the listed sphere, so that's off the table. And I think not-for-profits are always constrained in terms of money, and so there's got to be a much higher emphasis on the employee value proposition and the clarity of purpose, because that's what draws a lot of people to those organisations. So yes, I think variable remuneration in a not-for-profit is much more problematic than it is in a for-profit, particularly a listed company.
Thank you. And I think that that's linked back to Simon's comment also about how we need to consider all of the range of the tools available. REM is one of those, but there are so many other facets to consider how we incentivise people. There is a statement, and perhaps there's a question in this. A quick insight into Chapter 2E of the Corporations Law would be helpful in getting shareholders' approval for directors' rem? Question mark. That might be we'll take that as a comment, and we'll move on to a question now relating, there's a few here together, in relating to job tenure becoming shorter. And really, how does that impact short and long-term incentives? Is that something that we need to take into account? Is that driving any behaviours, do you think?
Do you want me to kick off on that one? I think
Sure,
I think it doesn't have much effect on short-term incentives because they are by definition short-term and their focus is generally over one financial year. But I think there is an issue with long-term incentives. If you look at chief information officers or chief technology officers, how many of those stay in a role for 7 years? And that's how long it would take in a financial services large bank, for example, for their LTI to vest. And if it's quite unrealistic to think that LTI will vest, what's the effect of that? It will necessarily discount that in the mind of the candidate and probably drive up fixed rems. So I think it does have implications for certain roles.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I'd add to that, regardless, the quality of how long-term incentives are communicated and how they're understood also are a big factor in driving behaviour. So there is one thing to have them, but they're typically not well communicated and not well understood. And so it's arguable, as to how much they actually do drive behaviour.
Which I think relates to the comment about complexity also. If things are too complicated and aren't actually going to drive behaviour or be understood by shareholders, what's the point?
Yeah.
Wonderful. There is a question about how we can get a copy of the Governance Institute and Aon report. I've done a quick Google search with Aon GIA in the name of the report and found it on the website. Yeah. That's an easy way. I'll ask Governance Institute if they can, to include a link in when they distribute the PowerPoint slides to everyone. But hopefully you should be able to find that with Google today. Another comment, generally the increase in management and board rem, let me start again. The increase in management rem versus the increase in board rem, and senior executives versus the wider group of employees in an organisation. Do REM boards consider these sort of factors? And I guess in some way, how far down do we go through the organisation with those that variable at-risk pay? Any comments or any changes that you're seeing in the market in terms of where that might be an issue?
I'm happy to start off on that one. I think boards necessarily look at the relativities and look at the bigger picture. I think it's, one of the key roles of a board, never to lose the bigger picture. And during the pandemic, for example, there were plenty of industries that decided there would be no STI because of a range of factors, not the least of which was that they didn't think it was appropriate when numbers of more junior people in organisations were losing their jobs or were limited to government support. So I think that's precisely the big picture that boards have to keep in mind. If for some reason a gateway is closed to one group of people, I think the implications for another group have to be considered. And I think it would be a very unwise board to award itself or seek shareholder approval for a significant increase in the director rem pool when shareholders have had their dividend cut, for example. I mean, I think all aspects of the real world are relevant.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I was going to mention there are certainly some, there's probably not a lot, but there are some organisations who have adopted approaches we see in Europe around having policy around the lowest paid person in the organization versus the highest, and keeping a tight multiple there. So there are, which, you know, and they're more in the either not for profit or that similar space, but it's not common. But in European countries, we see a lot more industries and organizations which are looking at this sort of spread between top and bottom and managing that. I'm not sure that's something that we're going to see in Australia necessarily, but it's certainly happening in different places around the world.
There's certainly interest in understanding that, I suppose,
Yeah.
is the outcome. While you're speaking, Simon, there's been a question also around another acronym, and I'll put my hand up and say I don't know what this one is. EVP.
EVP. So EVP is the employer value proposition. So that's your broader talent strategy, but that's an organization's proposition across not just pay but experience. If you think about it as the employee experience, what are all the things that an employer puts together to attract and retain and motivate the talent that it needs to execute on its strategy? So a remuneration strategy is a component of a broader employee value proposition.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question, a specific industry, in this case, the mining organisations, those that particularly are still in the exploration phase, how do these challenges then play out for those organisations? Do we still have the same opportunities around structuring REM, or are they different in some particular way?
Where you tend to see these organisations with a much longer term view. These organisations do have a much longer term view, and so there's a lot more emphasis on LTI and longer term strategy execution, KPIs, etc., given the nature of the organisation.
I think that's back to our comments about it's not simply a checklist to run through. All of this needs careful design and thought, and great that we have REM committees to take on these challenges. We have another question to want me to ask. I'm sorry, let me just find it. Comments around our understanding of risk needs to be broadened just from financial risk.
Yep, I can comment, Tim.
Thanks.
If that'd be helpful. Yeah, I mean, ESG is incredibly complex. I think Sybil said it well when she said, let's think about it about risks and opportunities. I think that's the right way to look at ESG. It's what most stakeholders expect. The idea of risk is complex too when you think about a corporation's role in society, right? Like here in the US, we had the Business Roundtable where a lot of CEOs got together and said, it's more than just the financial impact. It's more than just how we affect shareholders, but also how we affect society, et cetera. I think when you think about how we were talking about it earlier, when it relates to ESG and incentives, there is, for public companies, this balancing act that must take place, meaning you can't give a huge payout for something on an ESG goal when you miss the financials. Hence the idea of a lot of times picking a metric for incentive compensation plans on ESG that has a tangible, quantifiable goal that could be measured to justify a payout. But as it relates to ESG risks in and of itself, there's reputation risks. There's this idea of double materiality. So you look at financial risks, and then you also look at what the impact on the world at large might be from your business operations, including with regard to climate change and environmental impacts. So I think that comment is correct. It's more than just financial risks, but financial risks are probably somewhere to focus on when you're thinking about comp.
I don't think it would be much different anywhere in the world, but there's certainly been a lot of discussion about non-financial risk in Australia over the last few years. We've had our inquiries into the banking industry. We've had a fantastic report from the prudential regulator, APRA, into the Commonwealth Bank that's really honed in on non-financial risks and really about how those risks bubble through to the board and its committees. It's an easy read, unlike perhaps the findings of the Royal Commission. And anyone that hasn't had a really good look at that report, the focus on the voice of risk and being heard together with the voice of the customer, really comes out strongly in that report. I'd encourage everyone to have a look at it. Personally, I consider it essential reading for any director, but there's certainly plenty of things for directors to be interested in and have a look at. Back to our questions.
Just to comment on that one, Tim,
sure.
I think the other thing that comes out of that report is how financial success can really mask non-financial risks for a very long time. And again, the role of the board is not to be lulled into complacency by financial success, but to keep a focus on those over the horizon non-financial risks, even if they haven't yet had a financial effect, because they will.
Absolutely. Thank you. We have a little bit more time for perhaps another question or two. This is a good one. How do you precisely define and measure diversity, equity, and inclusion for data measurement and performance processes? That's an easy question.
That's the topic of many training courses. I mean, I can start. Maybe Laura, you probably have something on that as well.
Yeah.
If you break that out a little bit more, just being fairly simple, diversity. You could take gender, you could take age, you could take ethnicity, but even just taking gender, most organizations have diversity targets around female talent. A lot of organizations have KPIs around that. That is quite easy to measure. The equity is a little bit harder. Equity is about fairness and justice and how decisions are made that impact individuals in the organization. That's more around looking at policy design and framework and outcomes. And inclusion, again, is quite a big one. But inclusion can be quite broad. Like inclusion includes how collaborative you are in the organization. Inclusion can include how you have inclusive people leadership. How do you consider the needs of people who might be introverted? How do you consider the needs of those that might work part-time and can't make all the meetings that are set up during times in which they're not working? There are a lot of ways that you can measure those. It's a very, very broad topic, but it is, most organizations have a fairly clear path for measuring this stuff. And Laura, I know you have a lot on that in that space as well.
Yeah, so Simon and I, we do a lot of dashboards for management teams to provide to the compensation committees that might oversee this or other committees. And key metrics that we think about are the demographic information, like where are you trending on a quarterly basis in terms of gender composition or ethnicity, depending on region. Hiring statistics, like who are you hiring in, right? So beyond the goals, what does the composition or demographics look like of your hiring practices? Turnover, also an important metric to take a look at, as well as promotion rates, right? Are you promoting at the same level across the gender roles at leadership versus broad-based employees? So basically, you can take a lot of the data you have within your own HR teams and really start to cut it by different, demographic areas to see if the goals that you've set or the qualitative practices you've set on attraction, retention, and development are really working from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective.
Thank you. We're nearly at time. I'd just like to see if there's a final comment from each of our panelists. Sybil, would you like to have any closing remark?
I would just like to follow on from that last discussion about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to say you can measure all the stats and report on them, but ultimately, I think inclusion comes down to the view of your workforce. And normally finding out by survey whether they think it's an inclusive workplace, and then breaking it down to see whether different age demographics or different genders or different locations have a very different view, which could be an indication of a problem. But it doesn't matter how fine your programs are that are in place, if the workforce doesn't think it's an inclusive place to work, you need to rethink it.
Thanks, Simon. A closing remark from you?
Yeah, I guess only to underscore, while quite a lot of this new, beyond REM data is, it does seem subjective and it does seem difficult to measure. It's actually easier to measure than I think people take people's starting point might be. It is very much around understanding the root cause of problems, but it's also about taking information we have today and making assessments about it. And if you think about, so take psychosocial risk, which is quite a difficult one to measure, but if you think through, that's to do with control over work and workload and support from managers and peers. We've got a lot of information from engagement surveys, from exit interviews, from different points around the organization, and you can put those together and you can synthesize a view and make an assessment on how safe your workplace is. So I'd encourage people to be open to that and to think through bringing multiple sources of data together really is the direction that we're going, and you can answer most questions by approaching problems like that.
Thank you. And Laura, a final comment from yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me here today. A lot of complex topics covered, but just remember that ESG is a journey, just like every topic we've talked about. And as the world changes, so too might your perspectives need to change as well.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to Sybil, Simon and Laura. It's been a fascinating discussion. As usual, I'm sure we could have gone on for another hour or so, but it's really been interesting. My key takeaways are the REM committee workload. Wow, that's increased and I can't see it changing. Environmental, social and governance matters and disclosures and strategies. If we're not all over that, we need to be. And there's not many of us that I think would say that our respective organisations have done nearly enough. And I think the expectations will simply continue to grow. And finally, data is key. And I use my favourite quote from an old CEO of Netscape, the browser that some of you might remember from some time ago, who said, if we have data, let's go with data. If all we have are opinions, let's go with mine. The presentation slides, as I've said, will be emailed to you, and I've had confirmation from Governance Institute that the link to the report will also be included. We have at Governance Institute coming up our national conference. It has a terrific lineup of speakers to deliver an interesting program which considers how modern philosophies affect governance and risk. We'll look at how moral and ethical underlay of our time drives these ways in which we live, we let live, govern and choose to be governed, and do business, and how we choose with whom we'll do business. How all of that impacts governance directions and our consideration of what is acceptable risk will be discussed. Speakers will include the American philosopher, Professor Edward Freeman, the father of stakeholder theory, Greg Clark, chair of the UK Cities Climate Investment Commission, Margie Seal, non-executive director of Westpac Centre Group, renowned journalist Peter Grest, Professor Megan Davis, Fred Hilmer AO, Julian Alro, chair of Queensland Ballet, trend forecaster Michael McQueen, and that's just a few. The national conference is being held in the Melbourne Convention Centre on the 12th and 13th of September. It's going to be wonderful to get back to face-to-face events, but for those that can't attend in person, you'll be able to join virtually. Thank you everyone for your attendance today.